what I propose to do today is attempt another kind of introduction to Savitri, but this time the point of entry will be Savitri and her yoga. Now, it is important to realize that Sri Aurobindo once said, and I quote from the book, the little book, The Mother, because this is also the whole idea, the mother being the bridge, the golden bridge. Not only is Savitri the bridge, the mother is also the bridge. And it's very clearly stated. He says there are two powers that alone can effect in their conjunction the great and difficult thing which is the aim of our endeavor, a fixed and unfailing aspiration that calls from below, and a supreme grace from above that answers. This is the first paragraph of the book, little great book called The Mother. And the concluding paragraph of the same book reads, the power that mediates between the sanction and the call is the presence and power of the Divine Mother. The mother's power and not any human endeavor and tapasya can alone rend the lid and tear the covering and shape the vessel and bring down into this world of obscurity and falsehood and death and suffering truth and light and life divine and the immortal's Ananda. This is the role of the Divine Mother. Now, Sri Aurobindo has said somewhere that Savitri and Satyavan were not just legendary Puranic characters. In every age, Savitri and Satyavan are born. It doesn't mean the divine in its full, as a full avatar is born in every age. But there is something called the Savitri spirit, something called the Satyavan spirit. And that's why very often Sri Aurobindo is identified as having been one of the great Italian painters. People say he was at one time Shakespeare, etc. It doesn't mean the divine is born as an avatar as Sri Aurobindo was also born as Shakespeare. It doesn't mean that, but they signify, they symbolize the same kind of spirit. And it is Ashwapati's work, his mission in life was to prepare the ground, explore the ground, and make it possible for the divine to descend and do very fruitful work. And the divine has to descend, the divine grace has to descend, and that is Savitri. And in this epic. And the relationship between Savitri and Satyavan, as you will see, was a particular kind of relationship in the Mahabharata story. It doesn't have to be the same relationship in all their avatars. Satyavan, in this particular story, Ashwapati was the father, Savitri was the daughter, and Satyavan was the Savitri's husband. Now, as I said, I'll probably talk about it tomorrow. Satyavan, as I see it, is the search for truth, search for divinity, search for perfection, which is hidden in the aspiration of each human soul. We are the Satyavan. And Savitri is the divine grace which comes down. And this Satyavan in us, as I will say to you tomorrow, is write poetry, falls in love in your teens, and by the time you are in your 35s, you become a howling cynic. The Satyavan dies very early, and the divine grace is necessary to keep this Satyavan struggling and going on doing that kind of work. Now, this is a story of Savitri and Satyavan which is enacted in our lives. Now, here, Sri Aurobindo himself has said what Savitri stands for. Now, since I see George there, I wanted to say yesterday he was not here, he was little apologetic, he was not here. He doesn't have to come for my talks because we are in the same wavelength. In fact, I was waiting for this talk before I could give this talk. His book on the mother's life would come because there are certain things about it which I'm not absolutely clear about them. I'm waiting for clarification from his book. But however, I will go on and say what I wanted to say. so that if he writes his book, he can write in a footnote, I entirely agree or disagree with Mr. Nadkarni. Okay, now on page 703, now I may not be able to read all the whatever I want to read, but those of you who have notebooks and have pencils, etc., and want to make a note in your book, he says, middle of that page, O Savitri, thou art my spirit's power. This is the supreme divine, the god of death, now changed into god of love, says to Savitri, O Savitri, thou art my spirit's power, the revealing voice of my immortal word, the face of truth upon the roads of time, pointing to the souls of men, the roots to God. Pointing the souls of men, the roots to God. And this is very interesting. While the dim light from the veiled spirits speak, dim light from the veiled spirits peak falls upon matter's stark inconscient sleep, as if a pale moon gleam on a dense glade, and mind in a half light moves amid half truths, and the human heart knows only human love, and life is a stumbling and imperfect force, and the body counts out its precarious days. You shall be born into man's dubious hours, in forms that hide the soul's divinity and show through veils of the earth's doubting air my glory, breaking as through clouds a sun, or burning like a rare and inward fire, and with my nameless influence fill men's lives. Now, this identification uh, of Savitri in this epic with the mother has been there. Many people have talked about it right from the time K.R. Srinivas Iyengar first wrote about these things. He also talked about Ashwapati being Sri Aurobindo. Now, this has never been very clearly spelled out. Now, I saw in collaboration an article by George where he clearly spells it out. And there is also an article of mine in 98, Mother India, where I also raised this as a quibble. I started as a quibble, as I said, why is it Sri Aurobindo, when he devotes 326 pages to the yoga of Ashwapati, mentions Ashwapati's name only once? And the same point he develops beautifully, and that's a point to be noted. So there's always this assumption that Ashwapati's yoga was Sri Aurobindo's yoga, and in the same sense, Mother's yoga was Savitri's yoga. But then there is a problem that the Mother's yoga does not end where Savitri's yoga ended. There is also another problem that even the earlier part of Mother's yoga does not coincide exactly with Savitri's yoga. And so, where does exactly Mother begin here, and where exactly the Mother's yoga ends? Savitri's yoga ends and Mother's yoga still continues. For example, what is described in Mother's agenda is her yoga. And that detailed yoga is not described, except maybe indications are here, but the detailed description of the yoga is not given here. And so it is dangerous to speculate for people and extrapolate from lines and say, this is what the mother was, this is what Sri Aurobindo said about the mother. He didn't say about the mother. If he said it about Savitri, he said it about Savitri. And one must be extremely careful generalizing from this text to mother's life. That's a cautionary thing. So I'm very afraid of trying to bring the mother very close to Savitri in this. Of course, quintessentially, Savitri's yoga is mother's yoga. And there is absolutely no doubt that Sri Aurobindo had mother as his model when he described Savitri here. Let me draw your attention to something which is very innocuous looking, which is not very spiritual. This is a description of Savitri. You will find on page 363, 365. Yeah. No, no, it's the god of death now converted into his real form that he is addressing Savitri. Those of you, there are some people here who spent their childhood in the ashram and knew the mother as little children. Probably when I read these passages, if I read them long enough, you probably, and you closed your eyes, you'll probably see the mother walking in front of you. But unfortunately, I don't have that time. But try this experiment, go home and read this particular passage, and you will see her. Because this is exactly the model that Sri Aurobindo uses in describing how Savitri walked, what her companions felt about her, and so on. Take this, for example, page 363, middle of page 63. A friend, and yet too great wholly to know. She walked in their front towards a greater light, their leader and queen over their hearts and souls, one close to their bosom, yet divine and far. Admiring and amazed, they saw her stride, attempting with a godlike rush and leap heights for their human stature too remote, or with a slow, great many sided toil, pushing towards aims they hardly could conceive. Who, if not the mother, give us to monkeys like us a project like Auroville? Did she not know we will stumble, we will spoil it at every point? She knew this. It's so because only it's the mother who could do this, who could say, look, you have the capacity to do this, try. And too many of these projects, our divinity within us, as it were, she was trying to pull it out. So he says, pushing towards aims they hardly could conceive, yet forced to be the satellites of her sun, they moved unable to forego her light. Desiring, they clutched at her with outstretched hands, or followed, stumbling in the path she made. Uh, some felt her with their souls and thrilled with her. A greatness felt near, yet beyond mind's grasp. To see her was a summons to adore. To be near her drew a high communion's force. So men worship a God too great to know, too high, too vast to wear a limiting shape. They feel a presence and obey a might, adore a love whose rapture invades their breasts, to a divine ardor quickening the heartbeats, a law they follow, greatening heart and life. Leave a few lines. Some turn to her against their nature's will, divided between wonder and revolt, drawn by her charm and mastered by her will, possessed by her, yet striving to possess, impatient subjects, their tied, longing hearts, hugging the bonds close of which they most complained, murmured at a yoke they would have wept to lose. They murmured at a yoke, mother cast this yoke on them, always complaining, mother expected this of us and that of us, etc., etc. Mother was very strict, etc. But she says, murmured at a yoke, they would have wept to lose the splendid yoke of her beauty and her love. Others pursued her with life's blind desires and claiming all of her as their lonely own. Haven't you seen letters? People say, mother gave X a broader smile than she gave me. Everybody wanted to possess mother exclusively as their own vital property. Claiming all of her as their lonely own, hastened to engross her sweetness meant for all. Now, I don't want to go on and on, but just to make this point, it is literally true that the mother was in some sense a model for Savitri. Aurobindo's depiction of the portrait of Savitri here. But as I said, there are limits beyond which one shouldn't try to see this close parallel between the mother and Savitri. Now, Savitri's yoga and Ashwapati's yoga are the two yogas described in this epic. Ashwapati's yoga, as you know, is primarily a yoga of divine knowledge. It's a yoga of exploration. Uh, in Savitri's yoga, it's a yoga of transformation. Some people have made the distinction. And basically, it's a yoga of the psychic and the yoga of love. And that is very clearly shown here. You can see, compare these two. Both of them more or less cover the same territory, but the way do it is totally different. In when you come to Savitri's yoga, you get a closer, a better picture of Sri Aurobindo's yoga as a whole, and that can be seen particularly in book 7, which has 7 cantos. Now, I'll read out a small paragraph where actually the yoga given to Savitri is described. And this is described in 8 to 10 lines. This occurs on page 476 and middle of page 476. This is a very brief recapitulation of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. Remember, the voice, the higher voice says to her, remember why thou camest. Find out thy soul, recover thy hid self. In silence seek God's meaning in thy depths. Then mortal nature change to the divine. There is one of Mother's prayers and meditations. There is a beautiful prayer which says, the first thing is to find union with the divine. And any method that your inner being finds attracted to, you follow that method. It doesn't matter. But once you have achieved that union, then begins the real yoga. Then begins the hard task of manifesting the power of this union through all the aspects of your life, right from the mind up to the body. And Mother says it's a very selfish aim to be lost in the contemplation and ecstasy of God union. What we really need is, after we achieve this is also necessary. Then mortal nature change to the divine. Open God's door, enter into his trance. Cast thou from thee that nimble ape of light. This nimble ape of light, is parading everywhere. It's as seen in spiritual circles as much as in atheistic circles. He is there, nimble ape of light, in his tremendous hush, stilling thy brain. His vast truth wake within, and know and see. Cast from thee sense that veils the spirit's sight. In the enormous emptiness of thy mind, thou shalt see the Eternal's body in the world. Thou shalt see the Eternal's body in the world. As I was saying yesterday, Sri Aurobindo emphasized this world which you reject as a corrupt world, an imperfect world, is in fact the body of the beloved. It's the becoming of the beloved. How can you love the divine integrally if you don't love the divine and whose becoming is all around you? That's why he says, in the enormous emptiness of thy mind, thou shalt see the Eternal's body in the world. Know him. I will show in what sense this is correct. Know him in every voice heard by thy soul. It's for nothing that Sri Aurobindo's yoga is probably the most, this may be a trivialization of the term, is the most democratic, is the most socialistic. And if you will see later on, very often people say yoga is a selfish enterprise. After all, what are you doing? You are withdrawing from the world and going within, right? So what these do-gooders would like us to do is to rush help like quack doctors where help is not needed or the wrong kind of injection etc., etc. What yoga suggests, first of all, is go within, find your spiritual resources, and then come back and possess the world. You need training for that. I mean, for doing anything, to be a doctor, even cater to one's body, you need 8 to 10 years of training. Now here you pretend to cater to somebody's spirit, and anybody with a long flowing beard can do it. First of all, you have to go within, find thyself, recover your spiritual resources. Then you can see what the world is suffering from, what remedies the world needs. And then everybody, as he says, know him in every voice heard by thy soul. In the world's contacts, meet his single touch. All things shall fold thee into his embrace. Conquer thy heart's throbs. Let thy heart beat in God. A complete union with the divine. Later on, you will see there are 4 kinds of muktis that are offered to Savitri: Sayujya Mukti, Sarupya Mukti, and so on. And Savitri says, I don't want any of these if they are not given at the same time for the whole of mankind. Insistence, whatever you want to give me, give it for the whole of mankind. This is the constantly one note that I don't want anything for myself. This yoga is not for an individual. If you are doing this yoga, you are doing it as a representative of mankind. This one should never forget it, because this is not a private personal yoga. This is a yoga of the whole creation, and you are simply an agent who is doing this yoga on behalf of nature, and therefore you can't appropriate the gains of this yoga just for yourself. That's why he says, thy conquer thy heart's throbs, let thy heart beat in God. Thy nature shall be the engine of his works. Thy voice shall house the mightiness of his word. Then shalt thou harbor my force and conquer death. Now, Julian sitting there and asking, you should all be there on time for dinner, etc. Because Savitri's yoga is a fascinating subject. Like Sri Aurobindo's yoga, this is a book on which very little has been written, and and someone like me, if you're asked to talk about it, I just can go on and on, but I don't want to do it. I just want to point to the peaks and their relevance to you, so that you can pursue this study in the privacy of your study room. Now, there is another point here I would like to take up, and this has something to do with this interfaith movement that Dr. Karan Singh talked about, and about which our Professor Jagdish Vyas asked this question. Didn't the mother say the world of religions is dead? Jagdish Vyas didn't realize that Karan Singh was too skilled a politician to answer that question directly, and so he answered it in some way. In one sense, the interfaith movement itself may be working against the exclusiveness of all religions. If that succeeds, then whatever poison there is in fundamentalism, etc., will automatically dry up. So that may be nature's way of, what is it that made religions what they are? This exclusiveness, the religious ego. Now, interfaith movement, if it's the right kind of movement, then it should enable them to overcome this religious ego. And if the religious ego is gone, religion becomes a pathway to spirituality. But whether it can be done, ego is more cleverer than all interfaith movement leaders. That is something people don't realize. But let's not go into the motives, etc., etc. Now, there is an interesting chapter here, canto here, called Triple Forces. And even as poetry, it's a fantastic canto. And, once Sonia Diane told me that when she was in London, she had some friends in the BBC, and she invited 2 or 3 of those people to read out this entire canto. And these were people who didn't know Sri Aurobindo, didn't know anything about spirituality, etc. They were simply people who were trained to use their voices for broadcasting. And when these three ladies came and read these three parts, Madonna of Compassion, Madonna of Power, and Madonna of Light, they themselves couldn't believe the effect of that poetry on themselves. They said, this is wonderful. We don't know what has happened to us. We just read it as we would have read, if they're broadcasting it. That's the kind of poetry there is. But I don't want to comment on the poetry for fear of Julian. So, so the point here is these three Madonnas are overmental deities. Savitri has already reached the overmental region. Now, the overmental regions is the region of all the gods. And these gods we have been worshipping in various forms. We have been worshipping them in churches, in mosques, in temples. And this worship didn't begin yesterday. It has been going on and on since the early days of religion. These gods, these goddesses have power. They have catered to individuals' needs, but they haven't been able so far to remedy the human problem. So if you want something for yourself, if you want admission to, in India, that's the big thing, IIT, or if you want a good job, etc., by all means go to Tirupati, and the God will probably satisfy whatever cravings you have. But that will not solve your fundamental spiritual problem. And until the fundamental spiritual problem is solved, just as you have gone for your son's admission, tomorrow you will have to go for your son's admission. And if you live long enough for your son's admission. So how long do you go on, and how long do you keep praying, and how long, people can do these things. But the fundamental existential problem is, how do we find liberation from desire, from inadequacy, from ignorance and death? This I don't think any of these gods have helped us achieve. That is why the mother has said the world of religion belongs to the old creation. The new creation, there won't be religions of this kind. That's what she meant. And so here there are three Madonnas, and first of all is the Madonna of Compassion. And she says, look, Savitri, I am your soul. You don't have to look beyond me. I have done so much for mankind. But all these Madonnas, then the Madonna of Might, say Durga, Lakshmi, etc., and Madonna of Wisdom, all these Madonnas are accompanied by, are followed by an Asuric perversion of these Madonnas. Now, this Asuric perversion of these Madonnas, gods have not yet been able to stop. And that's why we need to go to a world where these hostile forces or the Asuric perversions will not just be present. For example, anything that comes from above. Religion has been such a great thing. Science has been such a great thing. But each one of these things is being perverted by something here which belongs to the human mind. And that has to be transcended if you have to have the power to receive God's gifts in their purity and be able to use them for the right purpose. And that's why he says we have the three gunas, the lower nature, the sattva, the rajas, and tamas. They have to be transformed into their spiritual equivalent. And this is something that people have not been able to do. Even if you are self-realized, people like Raman Maharshi was a great man. I once met in America, of all places, somebody was present in Ramarashram the day Raman Maharshi was operated upon for some lump he had here. And the doctor said, no, this is a very painful kind of operation, that we'll take you to Madras, where we'll give the proper injections, etc., so you won't feel the pain. He said, pain? I can always rise above the pain. I don't have time to go to Madras. Please perform the operation. And they did perform the operation, and when he was narrating it to me, he had tears in his eyes. He said, it's such a great power. But the story is, we have all these, but what it suggests is we have capacity to rise above pain, but pain is still all around us, and God has not been able to gods that we worship have not been able to create a world where the harsh necessity of pain just disappears. Mother says somewhere in Savitri itself, what's it? The harshness. Now, pain seems to be necessary for man to rise beyond his immediate preoccupations and see that there is something greater to be achieved. Pain seems to be the goad. And mother asks, why should this be the case? Why should it not be the case that man's spiritual journey is from one arc of triumph to another arc of triumphs? Why should he go through hell? Who decided this? I'm going to change this. I'm going to challenge this. This is what the mother has been saying. And the gods have not been able to do this. And so these forces are triple forces. Each, as it were, is autonomous. But what Savitri is saying is only when the supramental descends, the triple forces will be triune forces. That one goddess will have all these forces in herself. And that's the world to which we are going. In other words, what I'm trying to say is this gives us a particularly insightful vision into the world of religions, into the world of overmental gods, and the inadequacy of the world of overmental gods. And the reason to transcend, go beyond the overmental gods, the supramental. Another, since it's a long canto, I won't have time to read it. Another important peak point I would like to draw your attention to is Canto 5 in the same book, called The Finding of the Soul. I have not given the page number, just Canto 5. The whole canto talks about the finding of the soul. Yeah. Now, finding of the soul, and as Karan Singh was saying in the morning, the Atman meeting with the Brahman, or the Hamsa meeting the Paramahamsa, that's the traditional terminology, is common to most spiritual practices. But what is described here is not just the Hamsa meeting the Paramahamsa. For one thing, the notion of the psychic being is new even to Indian spirituality. We have a term for that, but we have a term, people can look into the old scriptures. We can say Chaitya Purusha, that's the term, Chaitya Purusha. Sri Aurobindo has said we have a term, convenient term for it, but nobody really explored what this term meant, what its potential was, simply because their aim was not transformation of life, but escape from life. If you want to escape from life, you don't need the psychic and the psychic realization. You can just leave the ship and run away as fast as you can. But if you want to change this without the psychic being, this is not possible. And the psychic being also assures that your true individuality is not a fiction. And when you become spiritually perfect, your true individuality is not challenged. In fact, the notion of the Gnostic being, the psychic being becomes the Gnostic being. The Gnostic being will still maintain his individuality. In the more traditional yogas, when the Hamsa becomes the Paramahamsa, it ascends to that level, but there is no notion of a fusion and the creation of a Gnostic being. Now, this is something new that Sri Aurobindo and the mother talk about, and this is described here. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to read this and substantiate it on page 531. Sri Aurobindo has the notion, I have heard people say, people in Sri Aurobindo ashram and Sri Aurobindo devotees unnecessarily complicate things. We had the notion, Atman, why do you need psychic being? It's like saying we have the notion atom, why do you need the term molecule? Well, if you have more things to explain, right, then you need more terms. Terms are not just coined just for the heck of it, just for make oneself look more learned. They are needed, they have an explanation. Now, if you are talking about perfection of life, then you need something beyond. The notion of soul is not adequate, Atman is not adequate, you need the psychic being. And so the notion of Jivatman and the psychic being, their meeting, their fusion, all these are a part of the supramental yoga, and these notions are very, very important. They are needed. So it's not true to say, as some people keep saying, oh, people in Sri Aurobindo Ashram make simple things more difficult. We had all the time happy, the Manduk Upanishad has said that, this Upanishad has said that, other Upanishad has said that, no Upanishad has talked about these things. Let us let us give credit where credit is due. They have talked about the Hamsa rising to the Paramahamsa stage, but I don't think anybody has talked about in our scriptures so far about the fusion of these and the bringing forth of a Gnostic being. And that is being described here. And once again, this is characteristically Mother's yoga, Sri Aurobindo's yoga that is described in the finding of the soul. One more, in Canto 6, you have a beautiful description of Savitri achieving cosmic consciousness. Before that, there is something that is described. I had half a mind to talk about it. Just as Sri Aurobindo talks about the nirvanic experience in Ashwapati's yoga, he also talks about nirvanic experience in Savitri's yoga. The general assumption is, for some reason, Sri Aurobindo didn't know how the word nirvana is spelled, or he didn't know what nirvana was. He has said somewhere in one of his letters, he says, nirvana came into my room without even as much as knocking on my door and just possessed me. And it stayed with me for months and months and months. I submitted myself to it. I just didn't try to, shake it off. I lived in that experience. And then he says, what exactly the experience is, about 2-3 sonnets on nirvana. There are various poems he has written on that. And finally he says, out of that a new experience emerged. And he also says, if people come and say and tell me that nirvana is the goal of my spiritual quest, I will simply say, may God bless you. But if anybody says you can't go beyond nirvana, there is nothing beyond nirvana, that I won't accept. He says there are some souls, it may be true, for them nirvana is the highest goal. And there is a beautiful simile developed at great length here, 3 pages, epic simile, in book 4 of Canto 1, which is our Pasmukrama's favorite passage, where human life is described to that of a sailor on the infinity of life, where you are all sailors. And then at one point he says, whether your journey is going to end in a blank port, which is the nirvana, or in a port where you will find yourself in a new body and a new mind, this is a decision your soul has to make. And that decision is already there in your breast pocket, as it were. That's also, he says, a beautifully developed simile over 4 pages. So all these things are given here. And nirvana is also an experience through which Savitri goes. Now, this nirvana, in some sense, it may be the nirvana of other spiritual practices, but the nirvanic experience is important for this reason. The nirvanic experience basically implies a capacity of totally emptying oneself, including the mental world that you have constructed. The world that you see outside, I am not saying the tree and the stone, but the value system you put on this world outside and the way you respond to this world is a creation of the mind. And unless this world is annihilated, you don't realize how bound you are to your mind and its processes. And therefore, an experience of nirvana, as Sri Aurobindo himself says, is an absolutely necessary experience even in integral yoga. But you don't stop there. The other thing, nirvana is also this important, that on the spiritual path, depending on your exertions, your tapasya, you do get powers. But the great danger is that when people get these powers, they cling to them and stand there like frozen saints. The spiritual path is studded with frozen saints. Nobody wants to vacate the space within because we have got so much. But if you want to proceed, everything at every stage you have to be able to empty yourself. Nirvana is not just one experience, although nirvanic experience has a specific connotation in traditional literature. But in more general terms, nirvana is this process of emptying themselves all the time. You get new experiences, don't cling to them too closely, don't hug them too closely, because if you do that, the divine is helpless, he can't give you any more, because whatever space you have is already clogged up. So you have to empty yourself. And so that's what Savitri does. She empties herself. So she becomes a kind of conduit for the divine grace to work, function through her. And you remember, one of mother's great capacities was the capacity to surrender. When she first came to Sri Aurobindo, she was not a postgraduate student in spirituality. She had in her own right gone very far ahead. And when she realized that what Sri Aurobindo offers is what the world needs and also what she has been aspiring for, in a second, in a kind of minute as it were, she was able to empty herself. And when they first met in 1914, Sri Aurobindo was asked mother was asked what she felt in the first meeting. And she has written in her diaries that as long as the person we met yesterday is on earth, the future of the earth and its glory are assured. Sri Aurobindo was asked what he felt about her. He said, once I saw the capacity for surrender the mother exhibited, I knew at that moment the time for the supramental realization has come. That's a prerequisite. We don't realize how important this is, because the spiritual path is full of temptations, and the temptations are not outside temptations. They are not temptations of wealth and money. The temptations are inner temptations as well. The tendency to cling to these things, and this necessity to empty yourself all the time, that's something that you also find here described in Mother's Yoga. After that, I just want to read a little bit about the next stage, which is the Savitri is attaining the cosmic consciousness. And what the cosmic consciousness is, you'll see very clearly once you have gone beyond the ego, separated your Purusha from the Prakriti, then you can't come back to the world. How do you need a locus, you need a kind of station to function in the world. How do you function? Because you can't go into your ego. You have separated yourself from the ego. How do you then function in this world? For that, you function in this world through the cosmic consciousness, that you have an identity with everything in this world. And that is being described here very beautifully on page 557, about the last 15 lines. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them and they were all in her. That's her feeling. The tree, the mountains, the birds, everything, they were all in her. This first was an immense identity in which her own identity was lost. What seemed herself was an image of the whole. And then she describes, she was a subconscient life of tree and flower. The life that climbs up the trunk of a tree. It Savitri felt when she looked at it, it is she herself which is climbing through the trunk of the tree. And when the flower blossoms, she felt she herself is blossoming on the twig of a bush. So she says, she was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. This passion and the splendor of the rose didn't belong to the rose. They belonged to herself. She was burning with this splendor. That's the experience. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Out of subconscient life she climbed to mind. She flowered in her. The entire cosmos, she felt, was a flower, that grew in her, flowered in her. She was its bed. The problem about Sri Aurobindo's poetry is when you leave the poetry and try to paraphrase it in your prose, you find yourself so hopelessly inadequate. And so what do? You read the line again. That's all you can do. The cosmos flowered in her. She was its bed. She was time and the dreams of God in time. She was space and the wideness of his days. From this she rose where time and space were not. The superconscient was her native air. Infinity was her movement's natural space. Eternity looked out from her on time. Now, there is one more section which is very fascinating and which people don't know much about. And I would like to spend the next 15 minutes, of which 10 are mine and 5 are Julian's. No, I'm just joking. Otherwise, the discourse becomes too serious. So, at one point, as you will see, there is a debate between the god of death and Savitri. And I haven't said anything about that. It's a fascinating debate where the god of death, by turns, assumes all the possible philosophical positions, right from Harvard to Benares. Every possible position: idealism, pragmatism, nihilism, realism, Buddhism, Advaitism, Dvaitism, etc., etc. And he tries to corner Savitri, tries to convince her that what she proposes to do or what she aspires to achieve is not worth achieving, is illogical, irrational, cannot happen, never has happened, etc., etc. And if you were a judge listening to these arguments, unless you are an intuitive judge, I don't know in whose favor you would give the verdict. Because when Sri Aurobindo talks through the mouth of the god of death, he is as powerful as Savitri herself. Some of the arguments are couched in such powerful terms. This is what is called negative capability. Poets have to have this negative capability. They can get into anybody's skin, as it were, identify themselves with. And if Savitri has the advantage of Sri Aurobindo's poetry, the god of death also has the same advantage. He can also use Sri Aurobindo's poetry. And this has been done. This is where argument is converted into great lyric poetry. This is not attempted anywhere else. You have either reason or you have lyricism. Here is a place where passion, intellectual, rational passion, is converted into great poetry. And unfortunately, since we don't have the time, we won't go into it, but mainly books 9, 10, and 11 deal with these. Now, towards not 11, but 9 and 10. Now, at the end of all this argumentation, the god of death says to Savitri, look, I do concede you have a well thought out case. You have done your homework, etc. But nobody has realized a new world through arguments. What you need to bring a new world is power. Marx said it comes through the barrel of a gun. He didn't realize there are other kinds of powers. And so, where do you have the power? Do you have the power to bring down this new world? You have the arguments, I do admit. And tomorrow, if there is a more intelligent god of death, he probably will have other arguments. But that doesn't prove one way, that doesn't settle the issue. But do you have the power? And at that point, the god Savitri removes the veil on her face. And this is like the Vishwarupa Darshan in the Gita. The Supreme Mother herself stands before the god of death. And unfortunately, in India, even asuras are not allowed to be killed. They can only be transformed. So the white light that emanates from this glorious, supreme Aditi, divine, transforms the god of death. And suddenly, lo and behold, he is an enchanting figure of the god of love. That's another story. We won't go into it. We don't have time for it. And it is not entirely Sri Aurobindo's. The Indian tradition also talks about it. And that is why Westerners always felt Indians do not take the problem of evil seriously. But we won't go into it at this moment. Now, this enchanting god of death has not settled the score with Savitri yet. He tries other ways to dissuade Savitri. The first thing he tries to do is the following. He says to Savitri, the touch of earth has always proved something that that destroys, that corrupts. It does not allow anything to blossom. And if you and Satyavan go back to earth and live there, I don't know what will happen to your love for maybe another 20 years, 30 years. All the corruption that the world is full of may creep slowly into your own lives. Why don't you therefore, this is a temptation. Your kind of bond that you have with Satyavan deserves a special reward. I will create a new world for you, a new heaven for you, where you don't have to pay any income tax, no water bills, no taxes, etc. You can live eternally and forever and ever. This is the kind of bait he throws at her. And let us see what Savitri has to say. This is the perfect world. This is on page 685. Beginning of that page, he says, why are you always hugging this earth and people on earth? They're small minded, they deserve the earth, so let them be there. But you deserve better things. Yet if thou wouldst abandon the vexed world, careless of the dark moan of things below, tread down the isthmus, overleap the flood, cancel thy contract with the laboring force, renounce the tie that joins thee to earth kind, cast off thy sympathy with mortal hearts. Arise, vindicate thy spirit's conquered right, relinquishing thy charge of transient breath under the cold gaze of the indifferent stars, etc. And says, ascend, O soul, into thy blissful home, or in domains the wise immortals tread, roam with thy comrade splendor under skies spiritual, lit by an unsetting sun, as Godheads live, who care not for the world and share not in the toil of nature's powers. Absorbed their self ecstasy, they dwell. Cast off the ambiguous myth of earth's desire, immortal to felicity arise. And Savitri has a very, very appropriate, fitting reply. It's too long, but I'll read a few relevant lines on page 686. He says, I begin last, look at on page 685, last three lines. I climb not to thy everlasting day, Savitri says to the god of death, even as I have shunned thy eternal night. To me who turn not from thy terrestrial way, give back the other self, my nature asks. Satyavan, thy spaces need him not to help their joy. Earth needs his beautiful spirit made by thee to fling delight down like a net of gold. Then he says, earth is the chosen place of mightiest souls. Earth is the heroic spirit's battlefield, the forge where the archmason shapes his works. And then he says, thy servitudes on earth are greater, king, than all the glorious liberties of heaven. The servitudes on earth are greater than all the liberties of heaven. Then he, beautiful poetry. Then he says, I am no stranger to heavens. I was born there, etc., etc. I have come from there. Then he says, in me, the same page, to end of that page, in me the spirit of immortal love stretches its arms out to embrace mankind. My love doesn't just embrace Satyavan. It's an embrace that comprehends the whole world. And then he says, too far thy heavens for me from suffering men. Too far thy heavens for me from suffering men. And then he says, I don't think any Karl Marx has ever said this. Imperfect is the joy not shared by all. Imperfect is the joy not shared by all. It's a longer passage. I've just selected a few lines. This is not the end of it. The God of love is more dangerous than the God of death in many ways. Then he says, okay, Savitri, there is one more thing you need to consider. What is it? You might like to save the world. Very laudable. We might propose you for a Nobel Prize, etc., etc. But have you ever consulted the world whether it wants to be saved? And this, I think, is one of the major themes of Savitri. God's grace descends from time to time. It's not that it just descended in India, it descends everywhere. But man has continually been rejecting it. Either he says, we are not yet ready, this is not what I wanted. I wanted something finite, something which I can understand. I don't, we are in love with our ignorance. And whoever comes to release us from our ignorance says, what about the kick I used to get in ignorance? I want that, I like that. So he says, what about the world? Have you ever asked? A few people may probably want to go beyond the limitations, human limitations. What about the majority? Have you ever taken a referendum on that? If we take a referendum, Savitri would fail. Because all of us, most of us, 90% of us would say, all we want is some minor changes. I always say for a joke, since I'm from Hyderabad, oh God, make sure that garbage is lifted from a street at least once a week, that there is no power shut down in the evenings, that the water is drinkable, that my daughter gets admission to a particular school. This is what we want from God. And he says, this is the humanity you want to save. Have you asked whether man wants to be saved? He says, this on page 689. A few can climb to an unperishing sun, or live on the edges of the mystic moon, and channel to earth mind the wizard ray. The heroes and the demigods are few. To whom the close immortal voices speak, and to their acts the heavenly clan are near. Few are the silences in which truth is heard, unveiling the timeless utterance in our deeps. Few are the splendid moments of the seers. Then he says, heaven's call is rare. This is not it. Heaven's call is rare. Rarer the heart that heeds. Heaven's call may be rare, but even rarer the heart that heeds this call. Rarer the heart that heeds. The doors of light are sealed to common mind. The earth and earth's needs nailed to earth the human mass. Only in an uplifting hour of stress, men answer to the touch of greater things. Only when they are, when they are pushed down, when they're struggling, when they're suffocating, then they, oh God, I would like to be saved. Otherwise, they're very happy, merry to be here. Men are only in an uplifting hour of stress, men answer to the touch of greater things, or raised by some strong hand to breathe heaven air, they slide back to the mud from which they climbed. It doesn't take very long for people to slide back because they like the mud. He says, they slide back to the mud from which they climbed. In the mud of which they are made, whose law they know, they joy in safe return to a friendly base. And though something in them weeps for the lost glory and greatness murdered, they accept their fall. To be the common man, they think the best. To live as others live is their delight. This is the God of love transformed. Now, what does the Savitri have to say for it? Well, Savitri says the following. And then he says, it's not the end of it, there is one more step in the argument. Why do you need the supermind? You see, until now, without you fellows doing any yoga, the earth has brought you from matter to life, life to mind. It might have taken 15 billion years. Wait for another 10 billion years. You'll all get there. You don't need any yoga and hard effort and struggle and Om conferences and aim conferences. None of this is needed. Nature knows. Nature didn't have any committees to guide nature how to arise from from matter to life, from life to mind. Nature knew this, and nature knows this. Leave to the circling aeon's tardy pace, and to the working of the inconscient will. Leave to its imperfect light the earthly race. All shall be done by the long act of time. This is on page 691. Well, then he says, Savitri's reply says, this can't be allowed to happen. If thou and I are true, on page 692, end of page 692. There are many things I have left out, so the argument and the reply sometimes don't match because I have not been able to spot exactly. If thou and I are true, the world is true. Although thou hide thyself behind thy works, to be is not a senseless paradox. Since God has made earth, earth must make in her God. What hides within her breast she must reveal. I claim thee for the world that thou hast made. If man lives bound by his humanity, if he is tied forever to his pain, let a greater being then arise from man, the superhuman with the eternal mate, and the immortal shine through the earthly forms. Else were creation vain, and this great world a nothing that in time's moment seems to be. But I have seen through the insentient mask. I have felt a secret spirit stir in things, carrying the body of the growing God. It looks through veiling forms at veilless truth. It pushes back the curtain of the gods. It climbs towards its own eternity. He says, I am confident of that, and there is a way I have found by which man will be incapable of rejecting grace. He might have rejected grace until now, and that is when the new power, new consciousness comes, man will not be able to reject the grace. Finally, when all these things are done, the Supreme is willing to bestow on her all his blessings. He says, I'm willing to give you what is called Salokya Mukti, Sayujya Mukti, Sarup, all these muktis I am willing to give because you deserve this, all these blessings. But Savitri says, you can give them to me in a form in which I can share them with everybody in the world. Then he says on page 696, Thy peace, this is what she chooses, Thy peace, O Lord, a boon within, to keep amid the roar and ruin of wild time for the magnificent soul of man on earth. If you want to give peace, give it for the magnificent soul of man on earth. Thy calm, O Lord, that bears thy hands of joy. Then the next page. Thy oneness, Lord, in many approaching hearts, my infinity in thy numberless souls. Thy energy, Lord, to seize on man, woman, and man, to take all things and creatures in their grief and gather them into a mother's arm. And finally, he says, give us thy embrace, which rends the living knot of pain, thy joy, O Lord, in which all creatures breathe, the magic flowing waters of deep love, thy sweetness, give to me for earth and men.